Good afternoon, YouTube. Chapter 25 is 25 pages. I don't know how I did that, but anyway, it wasn't on purpose. So, I'm trying to get all of 25 in one shot, and we'll see how it works. This is like episode 27, I think. Mr. Walsh to the rescue. I went to the cafe early the next morning before the sun had done more than pinked up the edge of the world. When I picked up breakfast for that prisoner, the hotel gave me a breakfast too. We ate our scrambled eggs and bacon and toast. I took the dishes back down the street, being careful to lock the door every time I went in or out. After breakfast, I had nothing to do but watch that prisoner and read Blackstone. I kept that book with me everywhere. I sat in Sheriff Bustos' chair and stared at Lester Portwell. When I'd stared at him all morning long, I looked at the clock to see how long until I needed to go get his lunch. The clock on the sheriff's desk must have been broken because it said 8:15. I checked outside. The sun still hung out way too close to where it first peeked out its head. If I had to stay here more than the few days Sheriff Bustos thought it should take to get Deputy Cogar out of trouble, I'd be so bored I'd probably give Les Portwell a gun and let him shoot me. I cleaned the office. I had to go to the town well 6 times for fresh water. I scrubbed the floors everywhere except Les's cell because I have to unlock it to let myself in and he would get out. I cleaned off the desk and laid out a clean piece of paper to write important things on. The paper had been wrapped around the fabric I'd bought but hadn't got around to using. I dug through my desk. Actually, it was Sheriff Bustos' desk, but if I was acting sheriff, I was going to act like that desk was mine. I cleaned out all the drawers and I sorted everything. I found a checkerboard with 13 checkers, 8 red and 5 black. I found a pile of corks and some string from the store that lay tangled in one bottom drawer. I pulled my knife out of my boot and I sliced one of those corks into checker shapes. I didn't figure it mattered what color they were as long as Les and I knew whose checkers were whose. I put the checkerboard on the floor next to Les's cell. He moaned and groaned, but he stretched himself out on his belly so we could play checkers. I figured he had to be at least as bored as I was, maybe more bored. He didn't even get to clean. We took turns using the cork ones and the red and black ones. I didn't figure he'd be very smart because he got himself caught by Sheriff Bustos again. I beat him maybe 1 game in 5. Les, you right canny. Why did you get caught? He raised his hand to knock the checkers off the board but changed his mind. My partner got away. He snuck out when the posse come and left me with no bullets and empty bank bags. He jumped 2 of my pieces and said, "King me." And then I went to knock all the pieces off the checkerboard. I breathed a couple of times to get my attitude back under control. Why didn't you tell Sheriff Bustos what happened? Miss Calhoun. He growled but spoke softly. Miss Calhoun, did it ever occur to you that if I said my partner took off with all the money, I'd be admitting that we robbed the bank? He thumped my head. Use your head for more than a hat rack. If I had to get close to Les, like to play checkers, I sure enough left my knife and my gun in that basket on my desk so's he couldn't grab me through the bars and take them away from me. He didn't know about the gun. Nobody did but me and Abby Kruger. I like her. She don't gossip. Les might have wondered what I was doing. He might even know I was loading a gun, but he couldn't know I had a 12-shot 6-shooter. I sat in the cell next to his where he couldn't see me, and I loaded that gun. That's a good wall, not just bars between the two cells. If we had 2 prisoners, they couldn't even look at each other. Every day after school, Elmer stopped in to bring me a note from Ma. Today's note was from Pa. "You've been sheriff 3 days without killing Les Portwell or throwing coffee on him. Good job. I'm proud of you. Annie misses you, and so do the pigs. We all do. I miss you the most. Come home when you can. Do your best till then. J.T. Calhoun." That letter made me so proud of myself. I was so busy being proud and uppity that I forgot to lock the door when I went to get lunch for Les and me. Les grinned really big and silly when I handed him his plate through that little slot. I turned to put my plate on my sheriff desk, and Mr. Gates sat at my desk with a dirty boot propped up on my piece of clean paper. I dropped my lunch. Good food splattered me and my desk and all over the floor. The plate landed upside down. The first thought through my head was gladness that they put our meals on tin pie plates instead of glass plates. Following hard on the heels of that thought was that I made a mess that I had to clean up. I wish I'd had a little warning so I could have thrown it on Mr. Gates. I maybe should have tried to think of some way to get to my gun and shoot Les or Mr. Gates, but all I could do was scream. I screamed as loud as ever I could, and I kept on screaming. Mr. Gates jumped up and came for me, but before he could get around the desk, Mr. Gosling busted in through the door that I still didn't get shut right. He grabbed me and shoved me behind him. Well, that put me too close to Les Portwell, and I moved to Mr. Gosling's side. Mr. Kruger raced in with a pistol in his hand. I used his distraction to get to my basket of fabric. 3 other people came in. I didn't know there were that many people out and about in the town instead of at home eating. 2 of the men were Mr. Jarrett's cowboy friends, Alabama and Kentucky. I didn't know people could be named after states until I met those 2. I thought the other one was Mrs. Gosling. Then I realized this woman was way too skinny to be Mr. Gosling's wife, but she wore a buckskin dress like Mrs. Gosling. Mrs. Gosling kept herself and her children clean. This woman needed a bath and needed her hair to be washed and rebraided. Her dress looked like she lived in it for years. It smelled like a dead deer, a long dead deer. Ma would never let me go into town looking like that. Maybe this woman's ma didn't teach her, or maybe she didn't have a choice. I watched while Mr. Gates made everyone stand still. He had a sawed-off shotgun in his one hand he had left. The barrel was braced up on the arm with the missing hand. I couldn't figure out why Mr. Kruger didn't just shoot him. When I looked at Mr. Kruger to see why he wasn't shooting him, I nearly wet myself. His gun was not pointed at Mr. Gates. His gun was pointed straight at me. Then Billy Joe snuck in. I sorely wished he'd gone after Pa instead. "Albert, stop this nonsense right now." The buckskin woman spoke loud and firm. Mr. Gates looked at that buckskin woman like he couldn't believe she'd be there. "Gladys?" Mr. Gates's face turned white like spoilt buttermilk. Then it turned orange like a stormy sunset. Blood veins started bulging out in his neck. His face turned purple. I never seen anybody's face go dark like that before. I hoped he was having an attack. "Thought you'd sell me to the Indians and get rid of me, Well, it worked for 14 long years. Mr. Gosling exploded. "You sold your wife to the savages?" If the blacksmith had had a gun in his hand, he'd have shot Mr. Gates right through his mean old heart. I know he would have. I've seen the look on Pa's face when he thinks about the Gateses stealing Ma. The two cowboys clicked the hammers back on their guns. Mr. Gates repeated, Gladys? This time he sounded confused. Didn't expect to see me again, did you? How? When? Mr. Gates looked so surprised. He must have forgot about the shotgun in his hand because he let the barrel drop down below the desktop. I heard a couple of men sigh in relief when he lowered that scattergun. I told you I would get free and come after you if it took till my dying day. This ain't my dying day, Albert. This your dying day. I wondered how she planned to kill him. I didn't see a bow and arrows or a gun or knife or nothing. Mr. Kruger eased the hammer back on that 6-gun he had pointed at me. I moved a tiny step closer to Mr. Gates. Then everything happened at once. Mr. Gates jerked up on his shotgun and fired. Mrs. Gates grabbed at Mr. Kruger's hand and yanked it toward her. He yanked back and squeezed the trigger. Mr. Gates shot again. I fell on the floor with a pistol in my hand. I shot at Mr. Gates 12 times while he was falling. I kept pulling back hammers and squeezing triggers until Mr. Gosling wrapped his big old hand around mine and stopped me from moving. It's all right, sweetheart. You got him. He's dead. He kept talking, but when I realized my gun had run out of bullets, I relaxed. I started breathing again. He took the gun away from me real slow and gentle-like. He peeled my fingers off of it one at a time. I watched him pull each finger away like they were someone else's fingers. Gun smoke filled the room. It smelled exactly like shooting rocks with Pa. It felt exactly different from shooting rocks. I swallowed and thought I should stand up. I tried to stand up and I couldn't. I tried to sit up and that didn't work either. Mr. Gosling sat on the floor and pulled me onto his lap. He held me tight against his chest. I didn't know if I could feel his heart or mine. That heart banged around like buffalo stampeding on a dry prairie. He held on to my arm so tight I could feel it bruising. It just didn't seem important, though, at that moment. Making sure Mr. Gates died was the only important thing in the world. Those two cowboys and Billy Joe came around the desk. They stepped over Mr. Gates and his bloody mess. Billy Joe and Mr. Gosling looked at each other solemn-like. Mrs. Harkin had given me solemn as a spelling word back when she was our teacher. I took a minute to thank God for letting me be there when Mr. Gates died. I didn't care if Mr. Gates was still breathing. I could hear his ragged breaths. Blood smeared down the wall where he'd fallen and was splattered everywhere. His head and shoulders leaned against the wall. I saw bloody foam bubble on his lips and drip down onto his shirt. He was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. Blood drained out of his side. That side had been toward me when I shot him. Drag him outside. I don't want to have to clean up any bigger mess than we already have. Mr. Gosling snorted. Mrs. Gates came and squatted down beside Mr. Gates. Oh, Albert, why did you turn out to be so mean? I thought she would cry, but she didn't. As much as I hated you, I never wanted you to hurt. She cupped his face in her hand. He moaned out a sound and he spit at her. Triumph and disaster fought each other in her victory cry as she slit his throat from one side to the other. I couldn't see how he had so much blood left, but Mr. Gosling and I both got sprayed with it. I seen it running down Mr. Gosling's cheek and dripping off his jaw. It landed on my dress, and I wondered where had she kept her knife. A gurgling noise from the other side of the desk made those two cowboys wince. One of them said, I'm going to see if I can ease him a bit. I hoped Mr. Kruger was dying too. Then, for Emmy's sake, I hoped he wasn't. Who got shot? My head still wobbled a little, but I felt okay. Evidently, I only thought I was okay. I hadn't even said it loud enough anyone could hear me. I asked again, pushing out enough air that Mr. Gosling heard me. Who's dying? Mr. Gosling put one hand over my eyes and carried me outside. We sat on the bench out in front of the jail. We just sat there in the sun with nobody talking much. He kept rubbing his hand through my hair to push it out of my face. One of those cowboys came out and squatted in front of us. He sounded like he got punched in the throat. I'll go get her pa. Let me grab one of your horses for him to ride back, eh? You know where I keep the saddles in the shed behind my shop. Get Billy Joe to help you. No man can saddle a horse quick as him. Might as well saddle 3 extras. Mrs. Calhoun and that boy will want to come in too. Billy Joe's busy. I'll get Bama. I don't think he's ever been out to their place. Bama's not needed inside? Mr. Jarrett's cowboy friend held up one finger, and then he abruptly ran around the corner of the jail. I could hear him throwing up. I never puked and splashed that big. He coughed and he gagged and he made all the same pukey noises over and over again. I nearly puked with him. Tucky, you doing all right over there? Mr. Gosling called to the sick cowboy. He gagged again. In a minute, though, he walked right past us. Mr. Gosling held me so tight I couldn't see where Tucky went. He'd been to the horse trough. I seen that much when he came back with his hair all dripping water and his shirt mostly soaked. But his face had lost most of the green color. I'm good. He closed his eyes and changed his story. I'm good for the moment. I'll probably throw up a couple of times a day for the next week. Kids always made fun of me for that when I went to school. If I got sick, I stayed sick. Anybody else sicked up, I sicked up with them. Me and Mr. Gosling sat there watching while Billy Joe caught the horses and carried out saddles. I didn't know Mr. Gosling had so many horses or so many extra saddles. Then I figured it made sense because of how many kids he and Mrs. Gosling had. I watched as Billy Joe and Bama and Tucky all trotted off towards our house. Each of them led an extra horse. Since they had a 12-mile ride each way, it made sense that they didn't race off. Mr. Gosling held tight to my arm. It hurt worse than getting tail slapped by that huge fish. I tried to wiggle loose, but he held me tighter. Don't worry, Pinky, your folks will be here soon. Mrs. Gates came and squatted next to me. She twirled one of my curls around and around her finger. You are a brave little girl. I hadn't been feeling brave. I've been so afraid that Mr. Gates would figure a way to escape. He had to kill our whole family to succeed. I couldn't let him do that. But I hadn't been sure I'd be able to stop him. I had done my best. My best had kept us alive last summer and into the fall. Today, my best ended up with Mr. Gates dead or dying. Mrs. Gates' dress had fresh blood smeared on the hem of it. My mouth fell open and words came out. How many people have you killed? Your dress looks like a dozen or more. Her mouth twisted up on one corner. She took a minute and looked at her dress. This is the only dress I've had for the last couple of years. Most of the blood is from animals. I've been working my way back here for about 6 months. I didn't know what to say to that. I opened my mouth and more words fell out. Letha had a baby. She didn't want it, so she gave it to me. I've been having that baby for most of a year. Her name is Annabelle Lee. My Letha? Mrs. Gates' eyebrows raised up like everyone's does when they talk to me. I seen her eyes were blue, like mine, like Annie's. I guess. Mr. Gates' daughter, Rufus's sister. Are they both alive? Are both of my babies still alive? Her eyes got bright for just a minute. It felt like the sun shone out from inside of her. Warmth squeezed my heart. She looked at my face. I can't keep secrets. I sure can't keep bad secrets. It showed on my face. Well, Letha's alive. I don't know who shot Rufus. I found him floating in the river. Letha's alive. Albert didn't kill her? I nodded and shook my head. I don't know anymore. Last week she was. She and Billy Joe come over most every Sunday for luncheon to see the baby. And he isn't much of a baby anymore. Why didn't Letha want her own child? Well, my mouth fell open again, and I kept sharing stories that Letha probably might have wanted to tell her ma her own self. Well, maybe on account of because she couldn't get away from her pa with a baby to take care of. I don't know. It might be because she wasn't married to the baby's pa. Mrs. Gates' eyes opened wide like she bit into a hot pepper. Her mouth dropped open too. I could see all of her rotten teeth. She what? Her voice came out like she blamed me for Letha's loose behavior. Maybe she did. Her breath stunk nearly as bad as Mr. Kruger's. Somehow I didn't mind it as much. You really can't blame her. I told myself that was a stupid thing to say, but as I'd already said it, then I had to explain. I mean, she didn't have a ma to teach her how young ladies ought to behave. She only had her pa, and he didn't much let Letha go to school, only Rufus. Miss Harkin could have taught her if she'd have been at school. Mrs. Harkin is a good woman. I looked up to see tears running down Mrs. Gates's face. Dirt and blood got gathered by her tears and dripped onto her dress. I've missed so much. My mouth fell open and words fell out of it again. Letha and Rufus missed more than you did. They had to stay here with him. I motioned with my free arm to my sheriff office and the man that I hoped had died in there. I hadn't seen Mr. Kruger come out the sheriff's office. Hadn't seen Les either. I had a real hard time figuring out which one I wanted to live. I had started liking Les. I had a terrible time not getting mad with him winning most all our checker games, but I liked him because he didn't let me win every game. I hated grown-ups letting kids win. They don't learn to play better. I bumped Mr. Gosling's chin with the top of my head. I'll be okay. You can let go of me now. Sorry, Pinky, I can't do that. You're shot. Your arm would bleed pretty bad if I let go. I didn't believe him. But I looked at my arm where his big old hand curled around and held on, and sure enough, blood oozed out from between his fingers. How many times did I get shot? Just one. That's a bunch of blood for only one bullet. Why do you think Mr. Kruger shot me? Mr. Gosling breathed in deep through his nose. He let his air out really slow, so he didn't have to talk right away. Then he did it again. After about a dozen breaths, he admitted, I tried to get a hold on his gun so he couldn't. Then Mrs. Gates grabbed the gun, and he shot between you and Mr. Gates. I thought that would have ended it. I couldn't believe after he yanked it away from her that he'd try to shoot you again. Mr. Gates fired both of those barrels of that old shotgun of his. Best I can figure, he tried to shoot Portwell, and Mr. Kruger stepped in the way. I didn't even know you had a gun. I'll buy it from you for what you paid for it. I don't imagine your pa would approve of his daughter owning a gun. Pa won't care. He's the one what taught me how to shoot. Who did Mr. Kruger shoot? I snapped shut. I mean, did he shoot anybody but me? He started stroking my hair again. It must have been blowing in his face. No, child, not on purpose anyway. He didn't aim to shoot anyone but you. I heard a rooster telling the world he didn't have nothing better to do but make noise, and the familiar squawk of someone's well pumping out fresh water started that rooster crowing again. Thinking of that water made me remember Mrs. Harkin having baby Joe. 4 of the Gosling kids came over to inspect my arm. They must never have met anyone who'd been gunshot before. It very nearly made me famous. More people went into my sheriff's office. Doc Fishface was the first to go in. Mayor Driscoll showed up and took off again pretty quick. I watched him go over to the saloon. He came back in just a little bit with a cowboy and a door. The two of them went inside the jail. When they came out a minute later, they had a body on the door. I couldn't tell who it was because they had covered him with a blanket from the spare cell. I hoped with all my heart it was Mr. Gates. I thanked God again that two-legged varmint had died. I smiled watching them carry that door and its burden to the livery stable. There's a table in the back where Sheriff Bustos keeps dead people while he's digging the grave. I imagined Mr. Gates laying on that stained old table. My heart smiled so big. Mr. Gates would never cause another family the same problems he caused us. In just a little bit, though, they came back. That puzzled me until I remember Tucky had tried to ease someone. Nobody tried to ease Mr. Gates. Mrs. Gates finished him off for sure. I guess they were going to carry Mr. Kruger to Doc's office, but no. They carried out another body covered by Les's blanket. I didn't know who had died and who was alive. I kind of hoped my checker buddy was alive. For Emmy's sake, I had to hope her pa was alive. That cowboy and Mayor Driscoll came back and carried the last person out of my sheriff office. I recognized him by his boots. My heart caved in for Emmy's sake. They carried Les Portwell over to Doc's office. Alive. Lester was alive. I wondered how long he had before he died, too. Even if getting shot didn't kill him, he'd hang as soon as his trial was over. They might not even have a trial for this new mess he gotten into. He is already supposed to hang for something else. Oh, so glad I hadn't had to be the one to kill Mr. Kruger. Not that I minded him being dead. Of course, I couldn't say that to Emmy. I couldn't say it to Adam either. Adam would have to be the man of the family now. He'd have to grow up fast. Abigail already took care of the money books at the store. I found that out when I bought my pistol. She said, "Don't you worry about anybody finding out you bought that gun. I know which records to keep and which ones to ignore." My poor Emily. Her pa might have been awful, but he was the only pa she had. I bet she'd cry off and on for years. And then I woke up. Someone had cleared off my sheriff desk, and I very nearly fit on top of it. My feet hung off one side. The backs of my legs were getting pinched between the tops of my boots and the edge of the desk. The pain went away completely from my legs when someone took a stitch in my arm. Instead of opening my eyes to see who all was there, I listened and sniffed. I knew who was there by the smell. The office smelled like I cleaned it, and it smelled like blood and gun smoke, but I could smell coffee, and Pa was there. I could smell fresh bread and flowers that meant Ma had come too. I smelled Elmer. He needed a bath. I smelled that crazy dream medicine. Maybe Doc Fishface had left Lester to die alone. Or maybe Lester wasn't dying at all. Maybe he'd just been hurt a little. Quit pretending you're asleep. I can feel your arm tighten every time Ma pokes you with the needle. I tried to smell who all was here, I explained without opening my eyes. Is Doc here? No. Elmer's voice squawked as he spoke. He tried again. This time his voice was much lower. No, I went over there and got the laudanum in case you needed it. Won't Lester need it? Well, he might need some, but Doc had a half a dozen bottles. He sent one for you, but said not to give you more than one drop. Even a drop is a lot. When can I go home? Just as soon as I get this last stitch in. There ain't enough skin to pull together. I'm afraid you're going to have a big scar there. Ma's voice cracked too. I'm okay. I'm just a little tired. Not bad like getting tore up in the mine. Pa let go of my arm. He had been holding it perfectly still for Ma's stitching. So, Miss Acting Mayor and Acting Sheriff P.G. Calhoun, can you tell me what happened? Who shot first?" I explained it all to Pa. When I finished, he asked one question. "How sure are you that Mr. Kruger shot you?" "Ask Mr. Gosling. He saw it too. I didn't even know it happened until later. I was too busy shooting Mr. Gates." Tears ran down my face. I didn't know I was going to cry. Emmy's going to be so sad. Her pa died. After that, no one had much to say. I rode home, sitting in the saddle in front of Pa. I don't remember the ride home. I only remember how sick and terrible I felt. If I had locked that door, Emmy's pa and Les Portwell would still be alive and well. I'd have bet little Buddy that Mr. Gates would have found a way in somehow, but he hadn't had to. This was all my fault. The next day we had Mr. Gates's funeral. They had it at the cemetery. Abigail Kruger sang her funeral song, and Pastor had all of us say the 23rd Psalm together. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." That shadow from the valley of death moved to the inside of me. A weight lay hard on my heart. It felt like a huge rock had gotten stuck in my chest where my heart belonged. It might not be my fault that Mr. Kruger died. He went in on his own free will. But Les Portwell didn't have a choice. His death, even though we were going to hang him right after his trial in a couple weeks, that was my fault. Les was a grown-up, but he had become a friend of sorts. I hated losing to him in checkers, but because I knew he didn't let me win on purpose, I'd enjoy each win more than if I believed he might have fudged a little. I'd probably never play checkers again without thinking of him. It didn't even matter that half our pieces were cut out of whiskey bottle corks. I liked Les. The day after Mr. Gates's funeral was Mr. Kruger's turn to be laid to rest. Ma had right quick fixed one of the black dresses that someone had gave us, so I'd have a black dress to wear to my friend's pa's funeral. I could have wore fur breeches and no skirt to Mr. Gates's funeral, and no one would have cared. But Emmy was my very good friend. I had to be as solemn as possible for her sake. That funeral could not have gone worse unless the pallbearers had tripped and dumped him out. Mrs. Kruger sniffled and moaned through the whole service. She passed out on the walk to the cemetery. She screeched in mortal agony when they lowered his box into the ground. Ma kept one arm around her. It looked like Ma kept her from diving into the hole with him. The whole town showed up for Mr. Kruger's funeral. Everyone except Sheriff Bustos, who managed to make it back to Walsenburg right after everyone got killed. Sheriff Bustos stayed in town to make sure no bad men took advantage of everybody being out at the graveyard. My family waited until the last to leave the cemetery. I looked for Les's grave. Pa had told me on the way back to the house that first awful day that Les had been gut shot. He didn't have to explain to me what gut shot meant. It meant no matter how good of a doctor you had, your wound would kill you. Les had died, and it was all my fault. I looked for his big pile of new dirt. There were only two. One mound marked where Mr. Gates had been buried. The other tiny mountain waited to cover Mr. Kruger. Well, where did they bury Mr. Portwell? Why didn't they bury him here? He might have been an outlaw and a really bad man, but he deserved a place in the cemetery like everybody else. Pa cleared his throat a couple of times. Pinky, he's not dead. Not yet. I have to see him! I yelled at my folks and took off running back into Walsenburg. Pa nearly tackled me. He scooped me up in his arms and laughed. Whoa there, you runaway team of wild horses. Pa, he's gonna die. I have to tell him. What's so important that it can't wait? I killed him. Pa, I killed Les. I have to tell him I didn't mean to. Pa's mouth dropped open. Both his eyes narrowed like slits. His arms tightened around my legs and my chest. He tried to talk. I think he didn't know the right words and didn't want to say the wrong words. I killed him. I did. If I had locked the door, Mr. Gates couldn't have come in so easy. If he hadn't come in, he wouldn't have shot Les. My voice started shaking and my chin wrinkled. Stupid old tears ran out of my eyes. I killed Les. I need to apologize while there's still time. Pa didn't say a word. He just put my feet on the road, grabbed my hands, and we took off running. I guess he didn't think Les could hang on much longer either. In any case, we got to Doc's just as Fishface was leaving on an errand. Pa jawed with him while I snuck past them into Doc's office. I felt like a thief sneaking down the hallway. A cold grue slithered down the middle of my back and worked my hair loose from its braid as it tried to stand on end. Doc had blown out all the lamps in the main room. A pale yellow light peeked out from under one of the doors. Something stunk, too. I touched the doorknob. Now or never, I told myself. Either go in and apologize or let it haunt you forever. Knowing that it would bother me for the rest of Les's life and the rest of mine, I turned the knob and went in. It smelled worse in here than it did in the hallway. Pa had warned me that gut wounds are the nastiest way to die. I expected a bad smell. I didn't expect it to smell like a rotten outhouse. Hey, Les. Something in my heart smiled. I have never seen you without jail bars between us. I didn't even bring any coffee to throw on you. He snorted a couple of times before he turned his head to look at me. Why are you here? A sick room is no place for a little girl. He might have believed that, but he smiled like he was glad to see me. I came to apologize to you, Les. You? What for? He winced as he tried to roll over. I walked right up to him and took his rough old hand in both of mine. It's my fault you're dying. His lips went thin. Don't even imagine that. Albert Gates came there to kill me. He thought I'd talk to save my neck, and I might have. A man never really knows until he's faced with it. If they offered the chance for me to live at my trial, I might have traded life in prison for instead of hanging. Gates didn't know what I'd say at my trial. He was going to shoot me before you got there. I hope you'd peek in through the window and see him, but he moved to the far side of the desk. I told him you'd be bringing my meal. He might have planned to kill you too. But Les, if I had locked the door, none of us would have got shot. He'd been there a while before you came in with the food. He had planned to shoot me through the window of my cell. He could have done it too. I lay on that bunk and watched the moon and stars out the window. I'd stand at that window in the daytime and watch out. You know that. You've seen me do it. He'd have found a way to kill me. I nodded. I slowly felt better while we talked. I'll miss you, Les. A fat tear ran down the side of his face. I'll miss you too, Pinky. I sorely will miss you. He dug in his shirt pocket and came out with a locket. He handed it to me. That was my ma's. It belonged to her ma before her. I never had a wife or a little girl of my own. While we were playing checkers, I liked to think that, well, if I ever had a kid, I hope they'd turn out like you. I want you to have the locket. The chain was all tangled up, but between Ma and me, we could fix that easy enough. I kissed Les's cheek. Thank you. I will say a prayer for you every day I wear it. I got no right to ask you. I need to sleep now. Would you stay a bit and hold my hand till I doze off? I never minded being alone until I knew I was dying. I don't want to die alone. I nodded and tears rolled out both of my eyes too. I was still sitting there holding his hand when the sun came up the next morning. The except I had laid my arm on the table where Les slept. Doc came in and chased me out for a few minutes, probably to let Les use the utensil because he couldn't walk to the outhouse. When I went back in, he had a fresh bandage wrapped around the middle of him. He motioned for me to come hold his hand again. Pinky? What, can I get you something? He moaned a little. I got no right to ask you. Ask. I can always say no. Did you bring your gun with you? No, Mr. Gosling took it with him. He don't think a girl needs to have a gun of her own. He's going to try to talk Pa into selling it to him. I wish girls never need to shoot buffaloes or bad men, but sometimes we have to. His breathing was louder today. He worked harder at it, too. His face stayed edged with sweat. His hand was hot. My hand sweated just holding on to his. Do you have your knife stuck down in your boot? I nodded. Yes, I do. I keep it in my boot so I don't have to remember to put it in there of a morning when I get dressed. What do you need a knife for? Do you think suicide is a mortal sin? He tried not to make any hurting noises, but sometimes a little groan slid out. My heart shrank up a little bit. I don't know what a mortal sin is, but I do think if your horse breaks its leg, you have to shoot it so it won't suffer. God cares more about me than about a horse. I think if you're stuck in a mine cave-in and you know you're dying slow, maybe God won't think it's a sin if you kill yourself. If you've been captured by Indians or bad men and you don't want to be tortured to death, you could kill yourself to cheat them out of the pleasure of hurting you. It's never okay to kill somebody who don't want to die. But like me shooting Mr. Gates, protecting yourself or your family and friends is okay. Do you think God would forgive me if I killed myself? I held tight to his hand and pondered that. Would God think it was okay to kill someone who was suffering? If your friend was being tortured to death and you couldn't kill all the men that were torturing him, but you could kill your friend so he didn't have to hurt so bad so long, that'd be a good thing. I decided being mayor was way easier than playing God. God knows your heart better than you do. He'll forgive you. Doc doesn't keep a gun, I already asked him. He keeps knives. He uses that fleeing to let the bad blood out of people. He locked them up so I can't get to them. Can I use your knife? My knife? To die? I sure wasn't expecting him to ask me that. A big empty place opened up in the middle of me. All my thoughts and my air and everything just disappeared into the big nothing inside of me. My mouth dropped open and no words came out. He just squeezed my hand. It's okay. I shouldn't have asked you anyway. I pulled my knife out of my boot and folded his hand around the handle. A tear leaked out of his eye. Before we do this, I have to tell you something. Sure, I'm listening. I couldn't imagine killing my friend, but I knew that's exactly what had to happen. He hadn't been anywhere near this sick yesterday. I'm going to need some help. I could have done it myself yesterday, but yesterday I was too strong to ask for a knife. Today I'm too weak and too sick to want this to go on any longer. If we just poke a little bigger hole where that bullet went through, I should bleed out quick enough. It'll be messy. I can guarantee you that. It will be a big mess. I took the knife back and cut away Doc's bandages. I could feel the thump, thump, thump of Les's heart right next to that little hole that Mr. Gates's shotgun put in his guts. I wondered why one tiny little bullet had to miss Mr. Kruger and hit Mr. Portwell. Killing that buffalo to save Annie and me had been hard. Shooting Mr. Gates bothered me about as much as shooting a rattler. Killing Lester Portwell to save him from suffering would haunt me forever. I believed helping him get to heaven a little quicker might be a sin, but then again, it might not. I'd have to let God sort it out. I got one more thing to say. He couldn't even say a whole sentence at once. He had to break it up in 2 or 3 words at a time. I'm listening. I can keep your secrets or tell them. Whatever you want. You need to tell this one. Well, that was a relief. He smiled a little, letting me know he understood. Okay, who do I tell it to? Tell your pa and tell Bustos. Make sure the sheriff knows he let me go. I ain't tied up, nor chained up, nor handcuffed, nor nothing. I'm a free man. You tell him that. He lay there fighting for air for a while again. I held on to one hand and waited. He pressed his other hand against his wound. I'm not Lester Portwell. I wanted to call him a liar, but I didn't because he sounded so sincere. But everyone thinks you are. Who are you then? I'm Porter Trask. There's a $5,000 reward on my head. I want you to have it. You're Porter Trask? You must have done terrible stuff to be worth that much. I'm going to have to read your wanted poster again. I like to smile. Even near to dead as he was, he still smiled at me. 5,000, dead or alive. So tell the sheriff you figured it out. You don't have to tell him I told you. Come help me now. My friend held the knife and he and I pushed. He didn't lie. We made a huge mess. His life blood sprayed out all over me. It got in my eyes and even in my mouth. My dress was ruined. I wasn't sure but what I was ruined too. Ma and I would never get the stains out. And then I wondered, would a black dress stain? I held Porter Trask's hand until Paul came in to check on me. He'd been dead a while by then. I stood next to his bed, holding his hand with both of my hands. I had taken my knife and put it back in my boot. Absolute stillness surrounded us. I hadn't known what a serious business being dead was. Even dead, I couldn't leave him alone. The look on Paul's face was one I will never forget. I have never seen him look so lost. I never been so lost. Paul had to work to get my hand free from that criminal's grip. His blood had dried on our hands and stuck them together. Doc came in as Paul peeled my hand loose from my friend's hand. It took Doc less than an eye blink to see the truth of what I'd done. He gave my shoulder a squeeze and growled out a sound. He didn't sound angry. He sounded amazed. Doc kissed the top of my head. He must have found a spot that wasn't bloody. Paul and Doc chatted a minute, but I don't remember what they said. I understood each word like they were speaking English, and I knew each word, but I didn't know what they meant run together in a sentence. Paul and Doc redressed Mr. Trask's wound and carried him out on the same door that carried him in. Paul made me wash my face. We made a sad, tiny parade all the way to the livery stable. Paul had left Patches ground tied out front. I took that one dropped rein and felt better with Patches following me. I didn't want to be the last one in the dead line. We had his funeral 2 days later. Paul and Elmer dug the grave. Ma and me dug up some cowboy roses to plant on his grave, and Sheriff Bustos carved Mr. Portwell's name on a piece of wood to put at his head. I had time to memorize the 23rd Psalm and the 24th Psalm too. Pastor was there, but he stood quiet when I started talking about the dead man. When I finished telling most of what I knew about my friend, I started in on, "The Lord is my shepherd, I will want for nothing." Everyone joined in. When we finished that, we sang Amazing Grace. After singing, there wasn't nothing to do but just leave him there for the long business of being dead. I looked at Sheriff Bustos and I remembered all the good things about my dead friend. I smiled. He'd been a great checker playing partner, and he liked my coffee better than than Sheriff Bustos's nasty stuff. He was worth as much dead as alive. Not many people are. You're going to have to carve a new piece of wood for his grave. He stopped in his tracks and tipped his head sideways. After a minute of figuring, he said, I will. Why? Well, because Lister Portwell ain't his name. You got a wanted poster on him in your desk drawer, but you let him go when he was dying. There's a reward. I'm turning him in dead. The reward said dead or alive. I waited till he was dead. Maybe I'm going to be a bounty hunter like Pa when I grow up. One of Sheriff Bustos' eyebrows shot halfway up his forehead. Who do you think he was? I pointed to the box that Pa was nailing shut. That man was Porter Trask. Sheriff Bustos' mouth dropped open, and his shoulders sagged as he realized what I said was pure truth. Then he said a bad word. I couldn't help but smile. The next day, Pa walked me and Elmer to school. After Elmer and I had gone in and sat down, everyone heard Mr. Cantrell harping at Pa. Get that red-headed idiot out of my building. She don't deserve to be educated with normal children. Several students giggled. Nobody heard anything for a few minutes after that. Unfortunately, I knew Pa would get his way. He generally does. I would have to stay in school till the middle of May. We had 6 weeks to go. Pa didn't mind if I skipped school on Tuesdays for my meetings with Mayor Driscoll and Sheriff Bustos, but the other 4 days I had to sit in Mr. Cantrell's classroom. We had talked about it long after supper last night. I was here to stay. I sighed in frustration. The teacher didn't want me here, and I didn't want to be here. But neither of us had a choice in the matter. She's a liar and a troublemaker. Well, that made me mad. I never lied to him. I only lied to Rufus, and he was dead, so those shouldn't count. I strained my ears, but I couldn't hear Pa saying anything. I didn't hear him knocking the fool out of Mr. Cantrell either, more's the pity. I scratched my head and messed up my braids a little. Emmy leaned over and caught my eye. She winked and grinned big enough I could see most of her teeth. Her cute little smile had gotten cuter because she lost all 4 of her front teeth. A giggle started in the back of the room with a row of older students. They all sat closer to the door where Pa chatted with our teacher. I guess they could hear more than I could. The giggle worked its way through the classroom. Whispers spread Pa's words across that room faster than prairie fire racing the wind. The more people who heard what Pa said, the louder the giggles got. Adam punched Elmer in the arm, and they busted out laughing. I never heard exactly what Pa told him, but Elmer told me that Pa threatened to swat Mr. Cantrell's behind a dozen times for every swat I got. That sounded good to me. I hope Pa'd let me watch Mr. Cantrell get his swats. When Mr. Cantrell come back inside, he glared at me like I cut the tails off of puppies for fun. Thinking about him finding a rattler in his desk drawer pleased me, so I smiled at him. Until then, I never contemplated the value of a smile. My smiling made him so angry he near to choked. He almost choked on my smile. I promised myself I'm going to smile at him every chance I get. As much as I'd have enjoyed watching Pa bust Mr. Cantrell's britches, it didn't happen. Mr. Cantrell only spoke to me twice. First thing the next morning, he asked, "Miss Calhoun, will you move to the back corner of the classroom?" I looked around. The only empty desk had been turned around facing the back wall. A simple wooden box sat behind it for a chair. I gave him my biggest and best smile and declared, "I'd be delighted to sit back there." The look on his face said he expected a different answer. I picked up Blackstone off my desk and we went to my new desk. On the new desk was a list of assignments he wanted me to do that week. I had them all done by the end of the day, and I put them on his desk before I left. "Here's my work for this week. I finished early, so I read my book." I wiggled Blackstone at him, and I walked out. When I got to school the next morning, he had graded all my papers. Every paper had an F at the top, along with a note to look them over and give them back to him. Instead, I folded each one carefully in half, and in half, and in half again. Then I stuffed them down in the front of my dress, in case he got the idea to take them back. "Elmer," I just interrupted the whole class. "Elmer, I'm taking these papers home for Pa to look over. Is it okay if I ride Patches?" Elmer whooped in delight. Mr. Cantrell grabbed a handful of his own hair and growled like a rabid coyote. "All right, I'll fix your grades." He nearly exploded, he was so angry. "Oh, I knew you'd fix my grades." I didn't even try to keep the uppity out of my voice. "I didn't know you'd make Pa come back here again before you did." Pa went to visit him after school, and that was the end of 3rd grade for me. Not getting to give him a rattlesnake for a present turned out okay, since I didn't have to go back. We had a new teacher again the next year. Mr. Von Avery taught us on my 1st grade year. He left to go teach in Denver City. And then Miss Schwartz, who married Mr. Harkin, was next, then Mr. Cantrell. It seemed to me like our town was hard on teachers. Mr. Cantrell left town the day after school let out. It wasn't soon enough to suit me. Thank you so much for listening. God bless you. And it's important to at least list things in your heart that you're thankful for, but it's more important to know who you're thankful to. We love you. Here at Stone Cabin Adventures, we love you, but Jesus loves you more. Mwah.